And we are live. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As usual, this is a place where nothing escapes scrutiny. We examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain that which is most uh, factual and logically consistent. So today I have a special guest in the show. I have a special guest for us today. His name is Christian Watson. Um, so we're going to be talking about being African Americans, being either socially or culturally conservative and politically liberal. I have a sense that I have a hunch, I have a feeling because I'm not American, I'm not African American, but from an outsider perspective, I have a sense that African Americans are much more culturally conservative than their political leanings would reveal. And I don't know how true that is. I don't know how true that is, but I'd love to explore that with Christian. And since he is African American, I should be able to throw more light on that as we go in this conversation. So before we go into the conversation, Christian, would you just like to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're about and what you do? So,
Yeah, well, I just want to thank you very much for having me. It's always very nice to come on these shows and, impart some of my thoughts to the audience for their consideration. So I'm Christian Watson. I am currently a philosophy student who's about to graduate from university. But more importantly, I would say, I used to put a prefix before this. I used to say that I was a fledgling political commentator, but I'm just going to say that I am a political commentator. I am a fledgling. I'll say this. I'm a fledgling public intellectual. I focus a lot on the issue of individualism, political theory, on the theory of human freedom, and things of that sort. I have more recently than not, I have managed to talk a lot about race, but race is far from the only topic that I focus on in my commentaries. And so I run the Pens of Politics podcast, and I also write as well. I write sometimes about varying issues relating to the American political situation. And I also work for an organization called Color Us United, which is founded on the mission of establishing a race-blind society in the United States and maybe even abroad if we can get to that point. So once again, I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to having a robust conversation.
oh, thank you very much, Christian. The pleasure is mine. In some of your videos, I've watched some of your content, and would I be accurate to say that you are a conservative? Would that be an appropriate? Would I be correct when I say if
Uh,
I say that?
um, so political labels are very complex. Um, so I call myself a conservatarian. And what that means, for viewers who are not familiar with insider American political lingo, that means that I have personal tendencies which are considered to be conservative. However, I still value the primacy of the individual and the primacy of human freedom as the most important political calculations there are. So, more traditional conservatives would value the primacy of the community and cultural institutions to establishing this broad social order over the primacy of the individual. So that's where the libertarian part comes into my conservatism, because I think culture is important, I think and students are important, but I subjugate all of those beneath the good of the individual. So, yes, in a sense, I am conservative, but I'm not conservative in the sense that a religious conservative would be conservative, even though I am a Christian, or a traditionalist conservative or a Catholic conservative would be a conservative. I'm conservative in the sense that I personally value things that are deemed conservative, but politically I recognize that liberty must be at the centerpiece every single political decision, lest they be rendered immoral. This was a theory rendered by an American writer back in the 50s and 60s called Frank Meyer. He kind of mended the ties between what is called libertarianism, what is called conservatism in the American political lexicon. And now his project has come under heavy fire over the past few decades, especially in recent years, where there's now this debate on the right amongst more traditionalist conservatives about if libertarians have any place amongst the conservative corpus, because apparently libertarians don't value the same kind of social order that traditionalists value. Libertarians rather value a spontaneous kind of order that emerges from individual interactions rather than an artificially created order. So that debate is happening on the right. I've stayed out of it largely because I think that debate has been drugged through the mud, and it's been regurgitated time and time and time again. And I would rather focus my energies towards other ends. So in short, yes, I'm a conservative, but I'm a different kind of conservative than is normally thought of.
Okay. To me, it seems as if more and more there is an intersection between conservatism and libertarianism. It seems like both positions are getting sort of converging on themselves, where you find a lot of libertarians, having a whole lot of conservative ideas or conservative principles. Although you have made that distinction between your sort of conservatism as libertarian, which has some conservative ideas or tendencies. Do you think? I wanted to ask why is this convergence happening with conservatism? Why is libertarianism not converging with liberalism or with the left? Why is it sort of tilting towards the right at this point in time?
Well, this is a pretty complex political question, my friend, because on one hand, the fires of libertarianism have many different kinds of flames within them. Those flames have one underlying principle, and that is the valuation of human liberty. But even in libertarianism itself, there is a debate as to what exactly human liberty is. Now, I think this has been established time and time again. I believe that human liberty is a fact of human existence, and from that fact proceeds the rights that we all have, the natural rights that we all have. But there is also a camp, a quarter of libertarians who we call left libertarians, who embrace positions that are actually quite analogous to Marxist positions. So there are left libertarians that believe in the labor theory of value and use labor theory of value to advocate for certain economic systems. We call those the neutralists. There are left libertarians that want to, quote unquote, abolish capital, because apparently capital is immoral, again, borrowing from Marxist terminology. But they call themselves libertarians because at the end of the day, the goal is the restriction of centralized power, or the ends of centralized power being coercive. That is the goal of them. But they want to do so in radically different ways than what we call right libertarians. Right libertarians, which is actually what I am, believe in private property rights, they believe in free market capitalism, they believe in a laissez-faire mentality typically. So they tend to affirm the values that are generally associated with conservative. But I think that it's a mistake to identify political ideologies solely through the positions those ideologies profess to hold. That's a big mistake, because there are plenty of people who might agree with me on a particular issue, but lack the underlying foundational moral ideas that actually make my ideology possible and allow me to stand on firm ground. So, for example, G.K. Chesterton, I believe he concocted the idea of distributism. For G.K. Chesterton, communism was bad. But, and that's a position that many libertarians absolutely hold, but for G.K. Chesterton, capitalism was also equally a pernicious force, which is why he came up with a completely different economic system of distributism. And so just because Chesterton held an antithesis towards communism does not mean he was any way, shape, or form, congruent with my value system. Now, on to your broader question, though. Why is there a convergence between libertarianism and conservatism? I think this largely for a few reasons. Number one, I think that libertarians generally affirm the values of the American experiment, and conservatives absolutely affirm the value of the American experiment. They simply go about appreciating those values in ways that are semi-substantial. The more traditionalists will want to link those values in with more temporal societal understandings of certain ideas. So, for example, Harry Jaffa, who is responsible for the creation of a conservative machine, a conservative think tank, rather, called the Claremont Institute. He tied the idea of universal natural rights, which is what an idea that much libertarianism is absolutely concerned of and affirming of. He tied that idea with certain social values. And he basically said that if someone's a trans or someone's a gay or whatever, they don't have access to these kind of rights. So for Jaffa, natural rights is conditional. It's conditional on the basis of what social identity you hold. And if you hold a social identity that is antithetical to his worldview, you do not have those rights. Whereas a libertarian would say, no, regardless of what anything, regardless of any social idea or whatever, regardless of what you are socially, you still, by virtue of your humanity, possess natural rights. So you may have the libertarian who's much less concerned about what social identities and social views say, insofar as they relate to the meaning of concepts, whereas the conservative is wholly concerned with the opinions of society, so long as they satisfy their first principles and integrating those opinions with the general broader concepts. So there are some fine distinctions that they make a difference. They obviously make a difference, but the tradition of political liberty that is endemic to America has made libertarians and conservatives more amendable to each other than not. So that's the long answer. And I can go into more, but I don't want to stretch things out too much. That's the answer as to why I think there's a congruence between the two.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a perfectly good answer and a perfectly reasonable answer about the sort of intersection between conservatism and libertarianism. Now, so to the meat of the conversation today, like I said earlier, I have the feeling that a lot of African Americans are actually socially and culturally conservative, to whatever extent the word conservative itself means. I would like you to comment on that. How far off the mark am I, or am I onto something there?
You're not off the mark at all. So let's just make something very, very, very clear. The African American church, which I'm using as a proxy to identify the religious propensities of many African Americans, particularly the Protestant religious propensities of many African Americans, is an immovable force amongst many African Americans. And the Black church, as I'm going to call it, has definitively socially conservative positions. In 2004, 2004, I believe, actually, you had Bishop Eddie Long, who was later convicted of, not convicted, but later accused of being sexually molesting boys who were in his congregation. But he was an immensely influential televangelist. You had Bishop Eddie Long marching with Bernice King, who is Martin Luther King's daughter. And she's incredibly leftist. She was doing a speech at Martin Luther King's an MLK Day celebration, I think a year or so ago. And she said, yes, we need to get rid of property rights, stop worrying about self-interest, just a bunch of things that immolate the human spirit, and there's differentiations from other individuals, and it's sort of barriers between survival and tyranny. Because we understand property rights is simply the fact that I own myself. And if I don't own myself, then the legitimacy to transgress upon me becomes not a matter of if, but a matter of when. because there's no moral justification to protecting me. But anyway, you had Bernice King and Eddie Long marching in Atlanta in 2004 in favor of what was actually a very big political issue that in 2004. Wouldn't be a big one today because it wouldn't exist today. A federal marriage amendment, right? That's right. The federal marriage amendment to the Constitution, which, as I'm sure some people in this in the chat who are alive or who have studied recent political history will know, was an attempt of the traditionalist conservatives to integrate a traditionalist definition of marriage into the Constitution and thereby make it a constitutional impossibility for homosexual marriage to ever occur. This was a serious push. It was going through Congress. The Bush administration supported it. It failed, thank the Lord, because I think that's also immoral to try to have a sort of governmental answer as to what my personal relation should be is not only an insult, but it's also the height of immorality. Anyway, so what we had there was a big push, however, from the African American religious community in support of that bill, and now we don't really see a lot of that. I think the last thing as it relates to homosexuality that a lot of Black pastors had to comment on was the Obergefell case. And the Obergefell case made a lot of Black ministers who back in 2004 probably were not as well connected, but now are much more in the mainstream, like Bishop T.D. Jakes, made him say, look, guys, the world's going to be the world and the church is going to be the church. And I have no control over it. Please stop telling me stuff. Whereas, T.D. Jakes has in the past condemned the fact that there are Black boys who like other Black boys. He's condemned that in the past. And now he's with Oprah and everything. And he's kind of tampered down on it and said, well, I've evolved in homosexuality. But in reality, he holds the same position that he held before. So what's the point? The point is this. A lot of Black cultural leaders have been anti-homosexual. Martin Luther King was anti-homosexual in all honesty. His daughter still is. Bernice King, with as progressive she is, she still is anti-homosexual because there's just that very traditionalistic, socially ordered mindset that pervades the sentiments of many African Americans. And a lot of that has to do with the church. So yes, you're right. There is a very, very strong socially conservative core to a lot of Black folk in America, even Black folk who aren't particularly religious. And a lot of that has to do with tradition.
So my suspicions are sort of confirmed that because when I look at some of the things that you would consider traditionally conservative, say maybe religious affiliations, maybe even probably family ties, close-knit family ties, having extended families and all that, or even say the discipline of children, maybe discipline their children. I see those things as So I see those things as stereotypically what would happen within a Black family, within an African American family, than maybe within a Caucasian family. You get? So I see that and I say, these people are actually very culturally and socially conservative, which you have just confirmed to me that happens to be the case with many African Americans. But then it doesn't translate to the politics. And now I know many people, I know I've had this accusation before that I'm pushing conservative talking points, which is not true. Yes, although I have my own, I would definitely have my own positions. But the truth is that cultural and social conservatism is not translating politically into a political conservatism for Black people. Am I correct in that assessment as well?
Largely yes. Yes. And again, I think you can blame tradition for this. So let me give you a very concrete political example from the very recent future. So everyone knows that Joe Biden had absolutely no chance of winning the primary, the Democratic presidential primary, a year or so ago, or so we thought. I myself went to Iowa during the primaries before any of the states that began voting for the nominee for the Democratic Party, and I I sat right behind Joe Biden on a stage. And when he came out to speak, it was him and former Secretary of State and Massachusetts Senator John Kerry. When Biden came out to speak, he looked like a walking corpse. His eyes were probably half closed. His face looked emaciated. His hair had shriveled up like little strands, like as if it was just like almost gone. His body looked incredibly frail. None of us thought he had any chance of winning. You multiply those difficulties, his aesthetic difficulties, with the fact that he had no charisma and his intelligence has waned significantly over the years, and you would have thought that this person wouldn't have made it past a single state. Well, after losing Iowa, and I believe losing New Hampshire as well, Biden waddled over to South Carolina, and James Clyburn, the sort of grand poobah of Democrats in South Carolina, decided to go ahead and resurrect Biden, endorse him. Next thing you know, Biden wins Super Tuesday. He wins South Carolina. Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar drop out almost simultaneously at the behest of calls from Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, and they endorse Biden, and he becomes the nominee almost by way of a magical incantation, by way of necromancy, even. So, what does that have to do with like Black traditionalism? Well, it's very simple. James Clyburn, again, is the head poobah of Democrats in South Carolina. And in South Carolina particularly, the way Democrats vote is very traditional and very hierarchical. And so even though a lot of Clyburn's constituents, and even maybe Clyburn himself, may hold socially conservative beliefs, they've been so entrenched in the Democratic Party for so long, and they have, through that very long relationship, melded their interests and their being as Black folks with the priorities of the Democratic Party, and therefore have made that almost inseparable when it comes to picking a certain candidate. It's follow the leader and see myself in the reflection of a political party, and not see myself in the reflection of my own life, my own individuality, of my own desires and wants. No, forget all that. Let's see Black existence as simply a result, a manifestation of a social idea. This is exactly the problem with critical race theory. They see Black folks not as individuals, but as manifestations and victims of broad-ranging social ideas. I think that's part of the reason why you see a lot of Blacks not translating their social conservatism into more political conservatism. Why? Well, because they have a mistaken sense of self, which is aligned with the Democratic Party. Now, there's another reason. It could be possible, and this is confirmed by data, that a lot of up-and-coming African Americans are simply more liberal than their previous generation. In fact, this is true of a lot of people, whether it's white folks, Asian kids, people. I'm 21. People in my age group are vastly more liberal. Or I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't use that word. Vastly more leftist than their grandparents were. And this is expected almost, I think. But I think this is proven by the fact that Joe Biden won Georgia. And I know this is a controversial statement to some people. I'm just going to go for the sake of argument. He won Georgia in the United States election. And part of how he won Georgia is because Act Blue and Project Get Out the Vote, one of which was ran by Stacey Abrams, the Black Democrat in Georgia, who is possibly going to be the governor in the next few years. They got African American college-age women voted the most of any demographic, or more than they normally vote. And a lot of African American college-age people voted heavily as well. And that contributed to Joe Biden's 10,000 to 15,000 vote lead in Georgia. So perhaps more African American youth, like college-age people, maybe they're just more leftist. And that's a different equation to crack than why aren't people from the 60s, like James Clyburn, who hold socially conservative values, voting in line with their values.
So that's fascinating, because is it that African Americans are not able to discern that their interests are best served individually than just going with the group, what the leader says, and let's vote for this party? What's at play there?
Yeah. Collectivism is the universal affliction of political systems. And that is especially true of the American political system. I think that a lot of people cannot separate their identity in their life from the idea of a collective movement. And when you outsource your value to such an extent, and you secondarily make your value dependent on the government, and the government is nothing more than simply a controlled mass of force, which executes force in whatever direction a policymaker wants it to. When you outsource your value and you make it dependent on force, you're basically making yourself dependent on might, right? And you're subjecting yourself to the idea that might makes right. Now, might can be in the form of a physical force, which the government can certainly levy, or might can be in the form of intellectual force, which the government also can certainly levy by and through physical force or through other kinds of means. This is why a lot of government agencies, particularly the CIA and the FBI, they have propaganda arms, which control the narrative and say certain things they wanted to say. But that's a different story. But here's the point. When you're now involved in this sort of ecosystem, this sort of value-changing ecosystem of government dependence and of a flagrant disrespect of self, a lack of rational self-love, as a natural law theorist would say, then you can become bound to any particular political idea. And I think that political idea, for many Black Americans, is unequivocally the Democratic Party. Now, this can work in the other direction as well. You can have a Black person who's very, 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 very conservative and thinks that the Republican Party is the only way for them to be safe too. That's a wrong mentality as well. That's a very wrong mentality as well. Because ultimately, my humanity is not a fact of government policy. Government policy is a fact of my humanity, or at least that's how it was originally conceptualized. And so I think if more Black folk were to reclaim their value from these external systems, you would have, I'm not sure you would have a mass exodus from the Democratic Party, but you would have a more critical, inquisitive relationship between Black folk and political parties in general. And that would be a good relationship. It would be a relationship that Booker T. Washington would have loved, because Washington himself, for all of his blind spots, he said, look, man, I'm paraphrasing heavily here. He said, look, the destiny of the Black man is not, it should not have to do with politics or broad social movements. It should have to do with how they do in their own communities and their own lives. Black folk need to take that message, they need to internalize that message, and they need to live it vivaciously as if they have no other message to truly live, because in all reality, that is the only valid message that can allow us to live a life and have a chance at flourishing in that life. So that's my long answer for that.
Okay. It occurs to me that the Democratic Party has been very, very successful in securing the black votes consistently. So I have got to ask you, what do you think is responsible for that? How could they have done it? What are those particular things that they are doing or they did in the past and they are doing now that has somewhat solidified the Black votes as a consistent voting bloc for them? What are they doing exactly?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think a lot of it has to do with convincing folks that their existence is predicated upon policy measures, which then leads to a destruction of self-worth. I think that's part of the reason why Black folks are so dependent on any political party, but particularly since the numbers seem to reflect it's the Democratic Party. But then there's a more approachable reason, because for a lot of people, that's like, oh my gosh, Christian, what are you saying? What are you saying this about me too? And maybe I am, if someone's existence is predicated upon a political party. Maybe I am. But there's a more approachable reason. And that reason is the Democratic Party has ostensibly been behind some of the most profound civil rights advancements in the history of the country, whether it's the 1964 Civil Rights Bill or whatever. Now, also, the Democratic Party has been behind some of the most profound violations of individual rights in the history of America as well, whether that's going to be the FDR, one of a typical progressive, FDR interning Japanese folks, whether it's going to be Bill Clinton creating the crime bill, which helped increase disparities, which were, in all fairness, those disparities were put in motion by Nixon's drug panels, which, by the way, had a lot of Democrats and Republicans, but a lot of Democrats like Chuck Rangel of New York on them, because they believe that being tough on crime would help them fight crack cocaine abuse in their communities. I mean, so you've had a lot of things the Democratic Party's been behind, and so it's not good. It's not a good reason to support any party because they've done a few legislative achievements. That's a bad reason for any party. And rather, you should support a party on principles. But I don't think it's a matter of principles for most folks. And this is me speculating now, but I think I'm doing so deductively. It's a matter of survival, especially when you can capitalize on the issue of race to such an extent that you've made people think that their fight with racism or the answer to solving racism has much more to do about government policy than it has to do about how they live their own life and how they treat other people and how they view other people. Which is why this idea of systemic racism is such a farce, insofar as it makes a lot of folks think that if they're ever going to beat what the harm that the principle that brought Black folks under chains in the first place, they must do so through policy, through anti-racism training, and through all these other kind of militant, anti-intellectual, anti-humanistic endeavors. That's why it's a marriage of convenience, largely, produced from a false understanding of where problems in American society come from. Or how we can beat problems in American society, like racism.
Okay, so that's interesting. So, looking at the fact that African Americans are solidly behind the Democrats, they can almost count on them to be in their corner to vote for them every election cycle. Is it possible that the Democratic Party has become complacent in terms of the needs of the African American community? Is it possible that they might be taking that solidarity for granted, or is it that the African Americans are actually being rewarded, rightly so, for their support? What's been the experience of the African American community in overwhelmingly supporting the Democratic Party?
Well, you have to ask the African American community, largely, I think, about or whatever that might mean. But what I think is that the Democrats realize that the African Americans are a key voting bloc, which is why almost every election cycle, something about race comes up. Something about race, something about any kind of issue that is seen as impacting Black folks, that comes up. And it comes up in a manner that the Democrats believe will appeal to what they believe is the general sense of how African Americans feel. And so whether it's, for example, trying to defund the police, which many of them thought the African Americans wanted that, when in all reality, most of them don't want that kind of stuff. They want police reform, not being defunded. Or whether it's calling Trump a racist, which is an idea that pervades many in the African American community because of his tone, much not nearly because of anything he has substantially said. But whatever it might be, the Democratic Party cashes in on the cultural temperatures of the time, and they try to use that as a means of getting political currency, and it's working. Which is why, as I said before, you have to liberate the mind before you can have any kind of physical manifestation of liberation. So before we can convince other Black individuals not to, again, be so slavish towards parties, you have to convince them that, again, there's something, they should value something higher than the parties themselves, which is actually their own human life. They should value themselves higher than party politics. And they should realize that a lot of the problems that have been fed to them by the Democratic Party, or the system rather, are problems that are not beyond their control. So the problem of poverty, which plagues many inner city communities, many of which happen to be Black, is not beyond anyone's individual control, in my opinion. There's plenty of opportunities in this country today to escape poverty. It's not easy. As a child of a single mother we weren't poor, but we certainly were not rich, who worked 3 jobs to support me, it was not easy to get to a point where I could put myself through school, where I could get my own car, where I could manage my own bank account and have all my own money, where I could make a full-time living as I do right now from podcasting and media work. That wasn't easy. That took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. But guess what? I pushed myself through it. I did it without any highbrow connections, and I am constantly, still work in progress, but I'm constantly perfecting what I have cultivated over the past 4 or 5 years of studying, of discipline, of learning. But this is not a message that is sexy or appealing. This is a message that actually requires one to take a hard look at themselves, to critique themselves, to analyze themselves, and try to change what they're doing if what they're doing is not congruent with success, if what they're doing is not congruent with the height of their human potential. And when you already view yourself as oppressed or as defined by systems and institutions, are you really going to have the incentive to go ahead and try to achieve a sort of individual flourishing? Or will you be too worried about the community and society or whatever other false construct has been crammed down your throat? And will you be more concerned about them? And how do you address those things? Through policy. It is the biggest lie, the most pernicious lie that has been shoved down the throats of not just Black Americans, but every American, that their existence is predicated upon policy. And in some circumstances actually is, right? The government taking my property or not taking my property, that they can really hurt my life. But even then, my existence is bigger than any harm a man can inflict upon me. And this was actually, funnily enough, this was the same exact principle that animated the Underground Railroad, that animated the cultivation of spirituals during the times of slavery. This is the same exact principle, Charles, the same exact one. Why do you think they sung spirituals in the fields? They sung spirituals to reclaim the truth of Christianity from the plantation masters who perverted it and used it as a tool of domination, and to spiritually free themselves and give themselves the assurance of a better future through song. Through one of the highest expressions of the human soul, through song. So we need that fire back. We need the fire that's going to convince, by we I mean Black Americans, and all Americans in all honesty, need the fire that's going to convince us that we have more in our control than we think. We don't need a politics. We don't need a party. We don't need a pandering, hot sauce in my bag. We don't need any of that. We need ourselves and our good conscience. Emerson said, a few plain rules and good instincts is all a man needs to live. I happen to agree with that.
That's some pretty powerful statements. Yeah, no, that's good. I like that. That's some pretty powerful statements you just made. Now, I'm particularly, interested in the idea you put forward of how you've been able to sort of, eke out a living for yourself, although it was difficult, but without any connections, without any help from the government, without, some sort of external factors or some factors external to you, you have been able to create something for yourself. And you believe that to be true for every American who aspires to anything, to any craft, that they can be successful at it. So I want to ask, is it that African Americans have bought into the idea that on their own, they can make much of themselves without these policies from the government?
Is this, ask the question again, I'm sorry.
Okay, so the question is, from your own personal experience, you have been able to, make something for yourself without help from the government.
What was the last part?
Okay, so the last part was, is it that African Americans have bought into the idea that they cannot make much of themselves without government, some form of government policy or some form of government assistance? Or is that the case? Have they bought into that idea?
Oh, well, in the abstract, yes. So in the abstract, I think many of them have bought into the idea that they need the government to fix issues that are tethered to their existence, like racism. Absolutely. Or they need policy, rather, They need some kind of force behind them. This is what the ideas of anti-racism are predicated upon, not merely a change shift of values, but in shift in how we minister values to other people, a sort of shift in action. So yes, I think many of them from that standpoint have bought into that idea. But do I think many of them have bought into the idea that they need welfare and everything? I mean, there are plenty of middle class African Americans and even upper class African Americans who believe the lies that I identified a few moments ago. So I don't think this is entirely about welfare, although I do think that many inner city African Americans have bought into the idea that there is a system holding them down and that they need assistance, and they've used welfare as an outlet for that. But also, there are plenty of inner city African Americans who are very hardworking and are simply trying to make sure they can have a good life for their family. In fact, I don't think that many inner city African Americans actually want to be in the inner city. I think you see manifestations of what is it? Manifestations of longing and outcry of the deepest kind in inner cities. And one of the chief structures of that manifestation is going to be gangs. We understand that most gang members, when they're young people, they typically have no guidance at home, and they want to belong. Because human beings are social animals, as Aristotle pointed out, and many beyond them pointed out. They want to belong. And this desire to want to belong brought them into a evil enterprise, which is predicated upon killing and robbing and thievery, all kind of terrible principles. But it's affirming the principle of belonging. I think a lot of the inner cities are surrounded by that principle, and that's the bigger issue with me. Because when you degrade, and this is where I think conservatives are correct, when you degrade a foundational structure like the family to such an extent that you have less resources in a pool, you're going to have less opportunity, or rather, you're going to have less possibility. So like if you have a single mother, you obviously, and if you're, okay, let me preface this. If you have a single mother and you're in the inner city, if you have like a single mother and she's like Halle Berry, then you're probably going to be A-okay. Better than often most Americans. But if you have a single mother and like you're in the inner city and you guys are poor, you're going to have less financial capability, less potential in terms of what you can, where money can take you, than if you had a father in that same context. And you're also going to have less nourishment. People always quantify, nourishment or and that kind of stuff in terms of money or resource. No, you're going to have less parental nourishment. And I think that's a lot of the reason why a lot of boys in the hood go out and they join gangs. They need nourishment. We all need nourishment as human beings. We need nourishment of all kinds. And that's where they get it from. So yeah. But again, it's a very complex question. I don't like broad generalizations, but I think in certain geographical areas, there are certain mentalities that are blatantly evident, and that have been studied for a very long time.
Yeah. I mean, it goes without saying that it definitely would not apply to every African American. But if once a critical mass has been reached, then it doesn't matter who is dissenting anymore about that. So now, my next question, let's take it back a little bit about race. So this is 2021, and this is not the 1800s, not the 1900s. It's not even the 1960s or the 1950s. How is race still a very thorny issue for African Americans in 2021, taking into consideration all of the racial progress that has been made over the centuries and over the years?
Well, as I mentioned before, the issue of race has been recast from an issue of individual mentalities that sometimes used institutions, sometimes use other tools to manifest, to a matter of systemic facts that are ingrained deeply into the definition of what the nation is. That's sort of been the transition of our understanding of racism over the past 100 or so years. And I think with that kind of mentality, you're going to have a creature that is almost immortal in the minds of many people. Because again, that creature is not, you cannot combat that creature um, from, you cannot combat that creature within the jurisdiction of your own power. You have to take that fight to society. And this is kind of the point that Du Bois was making in Soul of Black Folk, one of many points. And I encourage, if anyone's ever read or hasn't read, I encourage Du Bois, excuse me, I'm saying his name terribly wrong. I know it, but I'm just tired because I've had a long day. Du Bois is a very profound thinker. I think he's wrong on a lot of things, but he's a profound thinker. But one of his points was the fact that he tethered that Black existence as of that moment in his day to political activism. And to a certain extent, I think that was a reasonable idea because back then you had Jim Crow and segregation, all that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of people have taken that idea and they've applied it in this era where things are way different because, again, it satisfies certain preconceptions that they have. So when you cast race as an institutional issue, as was done as primarily an institutional issue, as was done by the critical race theorists in the wake of the civil rights movement, then you can make race mean anything, or racism mean anything rather, and you can keep it alive that way, or you can keep the idea of it alive in people's minds. So yeah, I think that's part of the reason why race is such a big issue. Plus, when you have this massive idea or abstract idea of racism, you can convert any kind of incident or event that may have nothing to do with racism into a racist incident if they fulfill the criteria of the kind of systemic or institutional kind of racism that has been concocted in the laboratories of the critical theorist or whoever else is trying to infect the minds of Black folk with these kind of ideas. So in short, that's probably why it's maintained such a powerful sway over our culture, amongst other things as well.
Okay. So I usually like doing something in my live streams. I have consistent contributors to my program, and after talking with my principal guest for some while, maybe 45 minutes, 1 hour, I like to let other people come in and they can ask you some questions as well. So I don't know if that would be okay with you.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So we have Chloe here already. So Chloe, welcome to the conversation.
Hi, and hi, Christian. I think I first heard you speak when you did an interview with Benjamin Boyce.
Wow,
yeah. So I definitely agree with a lot of things that you say, and as being at least we both have spoken to Sheena, so as being classified or categorized as Black in America, there is definitely at least there's definitely a perception that you're raised with, especially with Black parents, that kind of try to inculcate you with the idea that America's out to get you, right? So for some context, at least, a lot of people on this show know but about my mother. But my mother was born in the 1950s in Louisiana, poor, and she was actually permanently disabled when she was born because she was actually born in a white hospital, and the doctor just pulled her out by her arm, right? and basically paralyzed her arm. And of course, at that time, my grandmother had no legal recourse at all, and my mother, has grown up with a deep fear of white boys specifically, because in that time period, like they had the legal system when they committed crimes, especially against Black women, was very, very lax. And my mother tried to raise me with this kind of idea of deep distrust of white people and the system and everything like that. But it didn't really stick with me because I grew up in Alaska, where there really weren't that many Black folk. So like if I were to kind of imbue myself with those ideas, I would have been even more of a like isolated or a loner. And but from, I think that one aspect of it, honest, like in terms of, you know, Black people kind of clinging to this idea is it is honestly intergenerational trauma that's largely untreated, I would say. And also there's what I can see is there's also a deep distrust of medicalization. There's a deep distrust of, you know, psychiatric care. My mom, she even became a psych nurse, but even her personally, she felt like she didn't even trust any of doctors. She's like, she thought that psychiatric care was a white folk thing, right? Black folk don't get treated for mental illness. And I think that is another portion of this clinging to this idea of systemic racism, and also then, you know, essentially teaching the wound to the younger generations.
Yeah, those are interesting thoughts. I'll be frank with you. And by the way, you know, what happened to your mother, what happened to many other Black mothers as well in that time period is inexcusable. And a lot of folks think, I know you don't think this obviously, but a lot of other folks, particularly of a certain political persuasion, think that when I talk about this issue and I emphasize the individual as the core value of, you know, of understanding the self and everything, and you know, reject color, because obviously when you do that, you reject the idea of color. I think that I'm invalidating the experiences of those folks. And I'm not, because first of all, experience exists outside of my jurisdiction. I only have words. I don't have the power to invalidate anything. Because it happened. And the fact that it happened goes beyond any human's ability to evict you from that thought. So that's just, I always thought it was weird. But in general, I don't like this idea of intergenerational trauma. And I think I made a video about this because there was a few tribes in Canada that there was allegedly someone who was either a sympathizer of those tribes or part of those tribes, we don't know yet, who was burning down Catholic churches. Because this happened after the revelations came out that there were, you know, indigenous kids taken from their villages, put into Canadian schools, and, you know, re-educated by the Catholic Church, and many of them died under harsh conditions. It was an evil act. But a lot of folks think that act, and there are no kids, from my knowledge, who were alive from when that happened. That act it justifies or somehow explains trauma on behalf of people in the future, people who were not even born during that time. And I have an issue with that. I think that anyone can feel a certain way about a certain thing in any time period. When I go to the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Resistance in Atlanta, I've been once, and I see videos of a Black man being lynched, that hurts. But it would hurt equally as much if it was a white person, in my opinion, because I'm not seeing a Black person getting lynched. I'm seeing a human being having their life taken in such a guttural and rights violating way. It's just, it makes no sense. It's not sensible to me that anyone could treat their fellow man that way. And so, but this idea of intergenerational trauma really specifies the trauma to mean something about someone's culture or race or whatever. And I don't think it's the best way of understanding trauma at its very core root. And if we have conditioned folks to see trauma like that, then we have bigger issues than quote unquote intergenerational trauma. We have a sort of intergenerational ignorance to the value of every human being on this planet, especially those whose lives were innocently taken by the specter of racism or whatever. So I'm very critical about those concepts. I don't really believe in them that much. I'm not saying that someone cannot have pain because their great grandfather was a slave. Like, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that contextualizing pain in terms of race or culture and assuming that people who were not even direct recipients of that pain or with the action that caused that pain have just as much claim to that pain. These are just things that I don't make much sense. So that's just my take on it. Yeah. It's not popular, but.
So I agree that intergenerational trauma is probably the incorrect word because, you know, I do acknowledge, like, of course, like I wasn't there in Jim Crow. I just have constantly heard stories about it. And honestly, on a certain level, like I've become desensitized to it. But what is the kind of the correct term, do you think, for this idea of teaching the wound, even though there has been no wound. It's essentially, marking, carrying on, trying to perpetuate pain as a defining feature of your identity.
So the question is, say that again, please. The question, I was kind of reading the comment and I lost track a little bit. Say that again.
So what do you think is the more appropriate term of essentially teaching pain based off of historical events as a feature of your identity?
Well, I think that's misplaced. That's misplaced meaning. That's probably the proper term, misplaced meaning. Because ultimately, this is going to sound a little bit subjectivist, but ultimately, I think historical events, in terms of their emotional impact on us, they may mean something objectively at the baseline, but they don't have to mean what a lot of folks make them mean through narrative. One of the biggest arguments I came against when I was a collegiate debater dealing with people who were citing people like Frank Wilderson, the intellectual father of Afro-pessimism, and all these kind of other ideologies. One of the biggest arguments was storytelling, which is a way to liberate us from European logic and all that kind of stuff into essential and not centralized, but into a prop up and graduate the experiences of Black folks from subjugation to the public consciousness. And so storytelling can really reinvent one's relationship with the truth in a way that I think is quite pernicious if we're going to ever get past the issue of race, or more broadly, if we're ever going to get past or grapple with effectively how to actually deal with real pain, human emotion, whether that's love, whether that's hate, whether that's whatever, trauma as it's so called. Storytelling can make things mean things they actually don't really mean. So I think a lot of this, if I'm a 21-year-old boy, as I am in 2021, and I say a guy from 1921 who got lynched caused me to have intergenerational trauma, I'm kind of making that event mean much more than it actually does, because objectively that event means there is someone in an era where there was a lot of racism and evil who unfortunately lost their life, and that's bad. But I'm so far removed from that event that I don't really see the basis for trauma. History is full with a bunch of ugly things, and if we just go ahead and scream trauma at every single corner, we can't really appreciate what these things mean and their at their deepest meaning. So that's my personal opinion. This is controversial because there are a lot of folks whose families have suffered a lot of different things who say, well, you're trying to invalidate my existence. I'm not. There are feelings, and I'm not. I'm simply trying to say that the way we talk about and understand certain events is almost as important to understanding how we view those events as what actually happened during the events themselves. And once more people get that, I think we can better understand the relationship between all of these various things that I mentioned before. So yeah, I don't think I would call it intergenerational trauma. I would call it probably misplaced meaning. Now, if you have someone like there's like two people I think who were alive in Greenwood, Tulsa, one of the best examples of capitalism and Black excellence, well, just individual excellence rather, in the history of America. You have two people from that riot. I think they're still alive. I think two or three folks, and one of them is a sweet little lady who testified before Congress, and when she was a little girl, the folks were burning down her community. They destroyed her house, harassed her, tried to kill her family. Someone like her was a very, 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 very close to a great tragedy, which resulted in things that shouldn't have happened. I wouldn't blame her if she still had trauma because she experienced it. But if her great-great-grandson, who wasn't there, said, great-great-grandma, you had that experience, and now I am traumatic. I'm traumatized by it. you're really cheapening her experience. Because, in my opinion, what she experienced is not something that can just be felt vivaciously through her. What she experienced can only truly be felt through her. So yes, she has more claim to things, to things. I'm not being very eloquent right now. She has more claim to certain ideas than other folks might have. Just as the victim of a crime has more claim to certain privileges than others might have. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think this, I definitely do agree that it does cheapen the experience. And that was something that I had to realize that, you know, if people are claiming that today they're experiencing just as much oppression as, 60 years ago, that does cheapen the progress and the experiences of those who actually did experience hardships 60 years ago. But I think that this also kind of gets into, oddly enough, some leftist misconception of what it means to give value to certain experiences and emotions. And it is, I see it as, they have to so deeply empathize. They have to feel those emotions themselves in order to give value to it, because they have they prioritize, from what I see, they prioritize value in things that are collectively felt. And because they're de-emphasizing the individual. So if everyone feels the collective pain of slavery, of Jim Crow, then it gives value to that experience for those people who actually felt it. And I believe that that's incredibly misguided. But then that kind of even propels a mutation of what it actually was to live in those time periods, because it wasn't all doom and gloom. They had families, they had music, they had culture, they strive forward, and obviously they strive forward to create more successful generations, like my own, right? My family, I would say, is quite successful, and that was based off of the values that had to exist back then. Like my grandfather, he fought in World War II. And I could see a clear line of values that he had learned even growing up in the hardships that he had experienced. And those values kind of propel my generation, at least in our families, to success to today. So it wasn't all bad back then. And I hate to see people throw away the successes and the striving through hardship even back then. I remember, this is kind of a cheap trick that I did, but when you had to do like in school, like in elementary school, where you had to pick a figure. You had to pick a figure, and then you did like a wax museum type of thing where you memorize a spiel about them, you dress up like them. I always did Madam C.J. Walker. Always, because I kind of basically memorized that story. And only kind of later I realized, like, she was the first female millionaire in the United States. But not even just black, just female millionaire, like of self-created wealth. And her parents were slaves. So I think we're completely dismissing the human spirit and the strength, even in hardship. And it kind of also goes to, things that Jonathan Haidt has said of, we are anti-fragile. And this idea of going back to the leftists, try to prioritize the collective evaluation and empathy with pain to make it worth something, I think is deeply misguided. And it's in a way, it holds people back.
Well,
can I make a point?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Kevin, welcome to conversation. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I completely disagree with what you said there, 100%. I do think you are creating the opposite of what the left is creating. You accuse the left of prioritizing the collective, and I could also accuse you of prioritizing the individual. I think what I see in leftist ideologies or leftist movement is that I don't see a problem with the collective sometimes, because I do think in many cases some people experience universal suffering. When there are legislation passed to target a certain group, you have to expect that there will be outrage by that particular group. So I do not buy the argument that collectivization is bad. I do think collectivization is good, and I do think sometimes when we focus too much on the individual, we sometimes miss the collective, because there are systematic issues that affect the collective and not only the individual, in my opinion.
Well, so if I miss the collective, then I'll be happy to miss the collective every single time. I am a radical individualist, and this has been a point of criticism with many people, because I don't think, first of all, collectives don't really correspond to real world terms. So again, you can have a group of people, and you can have 10 people, and you can measure those 10 people. 20 folks, measure those 20 folks, 30 folks. The more you go up in quantity of a group of people, it gets much harder to understand just what's going on unless you quantify it. And how do you quantify it? You quantify it typically, this is how political systems have worked for many years, by looking at majorities. So what the majority wants, or what the majority does, becomes precisely what is considered to be correct or most beneficial. This was Bentham's idea, this was Francis Hutchinson's idea, this is the idea of utilitarianism. And so really what you get with collectives, you get moral monstrosities. You get monstrosities which reject the fact of the individual. No, hold on, you can respond. Hold on, let me finish. You get more monstrosities. You get moral monstrosities. No, it's fine. You get moral monstrosity that reject the fact of the individual and take certain values that can really only be understood if they're measured by concrete instances and concrete values, the individual being the most concrete value on this earth. And it tries to graduate them to group values, which makes them incredibly abstract and therefore makes their meaning ever-changing and amorphous. So no, I think that if you're going to have any kind of understanding of morality, the individual must be involved. If you're going to have any other kind of understanding of values and desires, the individual must be involved. If you're going to have any kind of basis for just and moral political systems, the individual must be involved. They must be, not only must they be involved, they must be the emphasis of everything in that instance. Yes. So yeah, I reject the collective entirely. Now, does this mean that I don't want to collaborate with folks? Of course I do. But am I going to sacrifice myself, sacrifice my values for the sake of a broader group goal? Heck no. And I never have. Most people do. I never have. And if God, with every last ounce of breath in my bones and my lungs, I never will.
May I finish?
I'm done. Yep.
Okay. All right. So I get what you're saying. I'm not proposing that we abandon the individual. That's not my argument here. I am just saying that viewing stuff strictly from an individual perspective sometimes misses the point. Sometimes we have to understand, for example, if we think about gender, or if we think about race or those stuff, whether we want to view stuff individually, we have to acknowledge that society does not view stuff like that, and we have to deal with the perception of society. But because what you're describing to me now is a way in which how you view the world, but I don't think that's currently the way in which the world is being viewed. That is my point. So we can preach this statement all we want. I think in terms of its practicality, it's far flat, to be honest.
Well, I think everything is impractical until it's not impractical, and how it's not impractical when certain values in a sea change of values occurs. So I don't really like the argument for practicality because they take into account circumstances which correspond to a particular period of time and don't take into account the natural fluidity and change that occurs with social values and concepts. And I think this is true. Just look at any value and concept in the past. Hell, 30 years. 30 years ago in the United States of America, obscenity laws were very powerful because there are many folks on both the left and the right. Al Gore's wife was apparently on the left. She wanted to ban violent video games, and she routinely tried to get rap groups brought before tribunals on obscenity charges. And back then, the left and the right, many of them agreed with those kind of laws. Now, you do that today, you would get laughed out of the room because free speech is taken much more seriously in the public eye than it was back then. Values change, ideas change. What the collective, quote unquote, collective wants changes. And I don't want my morality to be based upon collective change or whatever. I want my morality to be based upon unchanging truths. And I think those unchanging truths exist outside of the individual, but these truths have nothing to do with the collective whatsoever. And they have everything to do with my nature as a human being. So what you want is a balance. And I hate balance. Just being honest, I think balance is a bad idea when it comes to moral situations. Because balance suggests that So balance suggests there are equally important parts of both things and that no one thing overrides the other. But I absolutely do think the individual overrides the collective because number one, the individual is the building block for the collective. Number two, the individual is how we can best measure values and rights. And number three, the individual is the sort of progenitor of society, which is the environment the collective exists within. So if the collective and the individual have have equally important meanings, that you wouldn't expect the individual to be the basis of so many things. And yet, alas, it is. So no, I don't believe in balance. I believe in subjugation. I want to subjugate society to the individual. I don't really care about what society thinks. I care about what people in my immediate life, who I build bonds with, who I build contracts with, not locking in spirit. I care about what they think because they have the most significance to my life.
Okay. Chloe, you want to jump in again?
Can I address some of the points
Okay.
here?
Okay, go ahead,
All right.
Kevin.
So this is where I was coming at, and this is a point I'm trying to make, I am not trying to get rid of the individual or whatsoever, but we have to identify that there are institutions that predate our existence or predate our current existence that categorize us and that somewhat stripped us of our individuality. For example, I think gender is a perfect one. We are put in a binary sometime by gender, and therefore when society try to pass certain categories or attributes onto us. For example, how do we circumvent those categories? That is what I'm saying. Like, we can at times say we want to be viewed as individual, but persons sometimes identify with a collective. For example, your religion, your sex, your class. Those are stuff that exists outside of you. And while many times in society, like for example, there are legislation that target gays, homosexual people. That has nothing to that is a collective there. And sometimes when you have a collective outrage, it's understandable because people sometimes identify with a collective, and sometimes we have to identify that taking on certain issue individually sometimes have this mentality of this divide and conquer approach. And sometimes we have to acknowledge that sometimes why we are so messed up individually is because of something that is external to us. And regardless of how we try to fight against those individually, we might not be successful because, as I said, the collective sometimes influence the individual, and therefore the choices that we make sometimes are limited until there's a structural change that somewhat open a new horizon to the individual. So I am not saying that the individual should be abandoned. I'm just saying this contextualizing our society purely from an individual basis sometimes is misguided because there's a larger structure outside of ourselves that try to define us and try to categorize us. And sometimes I just think individually, I think we going up against these systems individually sometimes is misguided. And when we want change, it's just unnecessary, in my opinion.
Okay. A few things. And then I'll be quiet. I think you do a few things in your response that are really interesting. So you say that I don't want to get rid of the individual, and I believe that entirely. But then you say there are things that go outside of our experience. So there was an ancient Greek philosopher that said man is the measure of all things. I strongly reject that idea because I agree with you, there is much more to this world than us. We're simply inhabitants of a world that pre-exists all of us, that pre-exists the concept of the individual, of the collective, or whatever. But the individual is the best way to understand certain facts about that world. If you didn't have individuals, how in the world could you understand the nature of rights? You really couldn't. Now, there are people who suggest that you can make rights a group thing. I think it's a nonsensical idea. You really couldn't, because rights correspond to particular parts of our humanity, which have universal meaning, but are assessed individually by the fact that we all possess humanity, and we all do so in such radically different ways. So that's one thing. That's one thing I think the individual is superior about. But then you say, okay, well, hold on. There are people that try to brand us collectively. Therefore, the individual fails. Well, this is nonsense. If someone looked at you and called you a racial slur, would you then define yourself by that racial slur? Likewise, if someone goes ahead, so I'm a homosexual, if someone goes ahead and makes sodomy law and says, you know what, you're an evil, disgusting person, and that one needs to go ahead and kill you or whatever, am I going to define myself by how that person feels about me? Of course not. Because guess what? My value exists outside. No, I'm not missing the point whatsoever. No, I'm not. You're not identifying you're not identifying a failure of the individual. You're identifying an intrusion on the individual.
I am identifying. Wait. I am identifying the failure of group are looking at societies purely from an individual perspective. That is what I'm.
Well, hold on. I didn't say anything about viewing society through
that was my primary argument.
But I didn't say anything about that. I said earlier that I'm not really concerned about quote unquote society. Well, in a sense I am. I'm concerned about my society, right? Society for me is when I get up in the morning, go get coffee, and I say hi to the cashier. Society to me is when I go into my classes and talk to my professors. Society for me is when I come on YouTube, I do my videos, I chat with people in my Discord. That's my society. Society for me is when I call my loved ones and I talk with them and I have fun with them. That's society for me. Society as this sort of broader organism, this sort of broader idea, which encompasses all of us, but is immeasurable, is a nonsensical creation created by the collectivists to ensure, no, really, and this is how a lot of people see society these days. They see society as this thing that is bigger than all of us. But that's a lie. No, we all have.
That's what I'm saying.
Look, I think we have different ideas of what society is. And what I'm saying is, even if people try to define me as something by imposing categories on me, that does not mean the category that I actually am fails. The individual category, that does not fail.
I'm not denying that, but let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a very somewhat of a personal question. If there's a law in the state that homosexuals should be in prison, doesn't that somewhat impact your individual freedom as a person who identify with such?
Yes.
That is my point. That we engage in this. Wait, let me finish. That is my point. We engage in it as structure. We cannot just say, okay, it's just an individual thing. Sometimes it requires the collective. And I think if we want to change such a law, the interests of the collective are looking at stuff from a collective. It's more paramount in such circumstances.
Okay, so the thing is, collective interest is so hard to measure, and this is one of the reasons why why various political movements such as the LGBTQ movement or whatever are tearing apart at the seams. So, for an example, there's a movement within the LGBT. Well, Kevin, I can't explain my ideas if you keep interrupting me, man. I can't. I'm trying to explain my ideas.
I'm really.
Let him
I can't. I'm trying to make a broader point about the idea of the collective here. What you're saying is the collective, I think, is a mistake. It's not the collective. When I collaborate with people, I'm not engaging in collectivism. Collectivism is a very particular form of engagement which requires the subjugation of my individual values, self-sacrifice, to a broader idea or a broader goal. This idea was especially seen in the Soviet Union when Stalin went ahead and commandeered. He stole the kulaks, the Ukrainian farmers' lands, and said, hey, you go for the benefit of society now. He collectivized all the farms, ended up killing all of them. That is what collectivism is on a sort of governmental level, on an individual level, it's Black Lives Matter, destroying your individuality, groveling before this grand idea that escapes you. Yes, but that's what it is. It's anything that subjugates you to a broader group idea, whether that's a fraternity or a sorority, whether that's a general political organization that does not care about your personal values. That's what collectivism is. There are many different strains of collectivism, and some are less pernicious than others for strains of collectivism. The point is this: just because I work with a bunch of people does not mean I'm doing something in terms of collectivism. So that's my point. Collaboration, which is the principle of the sociability of man, that is the building block of society. But as the natural law theorist Emerson Vital said, the sociability of man can only be activated, which basically means I can only work with other people to the extent that I love myself. If I don't have a rational self-love, which was his idea, and the natural law theorist's idea of rational self-interest, which is also an idea that Ayn Rand kind of took away from natural law and made into our own system. If I don't have that, I don't have the basis for any group activity. Because if this vessel that I'm going to the world with, is not activated, is not okay, it's not maintained, what can I give to a collective? I can't give anything. So ultimately, I understand your point. I think you're kind of mistaking principles because they seem analogous, but ultimately I don't think they actually are analogous. But I understand what you're saying. I disagree for the reasons I stated.
Okay, let me respond. Can I respond on one sec, please? No, Charles, no, Christian. I'm familiar with your argument, Christian. I watch a couple of your videos already, so I'm pretty much familiar with the argument. I'm the same. I think the barrier here is that we define the term collective differently. I think you define it more perniciously than I have. My definition of collective is simple: identify that there's some interest greater than yourself. And sometimes collectivization in fighting those issues is paramount. That is my definition of collectivism. I think sometimes when you describe collectivism, it's just this we are taking away the individual right and whatsoever. That is not. My definition is sometimes when we collectivize, it increases our individuality. So I guess if you try to look at it from my perspective, then I guess the issue will change, because I think that many of our social movement that has come abroad in the 21st or the 20th century has been because of us identifying, hey, we have to put across ourselves. So for example, I think one of the things I would point out, probably you would not like it. For example, LeBron James, right? LeBron James now is a very rich guy. Have access to a lot of wealth. I'll assume that he have access to good lawyers and whatever. But there are some issue. For example, I'm going off of him. He claimed that the Black community is still broken, and even though he escaped the poverty or whatever, there are certain issues there that he still identify as. So therefore, not because he has amassed this amount of wealth, therefore he as a Black person still identify with certain issues. So that is my idea of collectivism, that hey, you don't have to be directly impacted by something. We have to acknowledge that in any cases, situation could have been differently, and therefore it's just a reminiscence. I say, hey, this could have been different, and therefore I could have been in this situation. I don't have to be experiencing this, but I'm identifying that this needs to be changed for increase in the individual freedom in our society. And I do not think, and I could make an argument here too, that just focusing on the individual is very detrimental to society. Sometimes we need a lot of restriction on the individual, but I won't go off in that point.
Okay. So.
Well, okay. I don't. Okay. Sorry. Go on.
Okay. So I think this actually finally gets kind of around to, I think what you were disagreeing with, what I was saying, Kevin. But I think so. Identifying, even though you didn't experience something, you identify with pain and misfortune, even though you never experienced that. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So my point originally was, how useful is it when you're talking about experiences that are in the past and that are not happening anymore.
That are not happening anymore.
Yes. So
I think
again,
that really, I think that would be the where the disagreement lie. You think it's not happening anymore. The person who's speaking out against the issue think it's still happening.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, so I don't think you heard what I was saying before.
My apologies.
Should I, so my mother was born Jim Crow South, 1950s, disabled at birth because the doctor paralyzed her arm because he pulled her up by her arm, right? Horrific, right? Does that happen anymore?
No, I don't think so.
So do you think it's useful for me to take on her pain?
In the sense that we can acknowledge that the reason, we can acknowledge that the issue that she experienced in the past somewhat explains some of the situation you're in today. That would be my answer to that question.
But
I don't think you're obligated to speak out. I don't
know.
think
I'm not talking about speaking out. I'm talking about taking on the pain as your own, as if it actually did happen to you, and the usefulness of this in order to move forward. I am disagreeing with that idea. My mother's experiences, no one can take those things away from her, but no one needs to feel her pain for her in order to validate her experiences. And I think that that is a misstep in terms of discourse today, in which people think that you have to take on the pain in order to address the issues. And I disagree with that.
I think we're reading the situation in two different ways. I do not get that feelings from people when I see them protest. When I listen to people speak, my understanding of what they are protesting is that, hey, there are structural imbalances in place that was put in before centuries and centuries a year ago. And while there has been some redress, the consequence of those atrocities are still felt today, and we need structural change to change those atrocities. That is what I'm getting from it. I'm not hearing people saying that we need to identify, we are feeling the pain or whatsoever.
I get that, but
I'm not getting
you kind of like you were assuming that I was talking about activists and people who are speaking out. I'm talking about people, regular families who teach the wound to their kids, that cause the children to feel raw and to actually kind of go out into the world to experience more pain than they would. And I think that I see that as a problem. Right. I'm not talking about just the activists. I'm saying, like, there was something that happened earlier this year, remote work. And I was having an issue with a team that I was placed with temporarily. And my parents kind of brought up, like, oh, they're doing it because you're Black. And so they were kind of wanting me to activate this kind of feeling of, okay, I'm being racially discriminated against. Except, here's the fact. I never turned on my camera. They had no clue who I was. So the dysfunctions in that situation had nothing to do with race, but they wanted me to think of it in a racial way in order to potentially solve the situation. And that would have been a mistake because it was definitely not a racial thing. So I see that sometimes, because we are teaching the wound and we're causing people to be biased towards certain issues, that people are proposing certain incorrect solutions, when if we kind of weren't already biased or vulnerable to these ideas based off of past people teaching us their trauma from their past, I think that we would be able to actually find more practical and actually find solutions to problems, instead of just sometimes working on the biases that our parents gave us.
There's a large amount of what you said there I would agree with. I do think the discourse on race sometimes is very toxic, and it leads to outcome that sometimes perpetuate the issue that people claim to be fixing. I would completely buy that argument. But I do think when you say that, though, you're somewhat removing some of the blame from some people in society or some structure there that just do not want to see any progress at all. So while I can acknowledge that there are people when their approach to discourse is very toxic, and somewhat counterproductive and counterintuitive, I also acknowledge that there are many individuals in society that do not want to see race relation progress, in my opinion.
All right. So it's been a very, very fruitful conversation. So let me see if I can recap something that Christian said. When Kevin made the argument for there are certain things that are collective, there are certain things that will transcend the individual, there are certain violations that might have nothing to do with you, but it has something to do with the collective, and as such, we should come together to combat such things. And Christian responded that any such violations at all is a violation. Is first of all a violation of the individual, because it's individuals that makes up whatever collective you're talking about. So if there are laws that are discriminatory against, say, gay people, it's a violation against each individual gay person in the first place before it is a violation of whatever is the collective. So that is my sense of the understanding that I got from that interaction between Kevin and Christian. So yeah, so probably in that regard, both of them are going to have to agree to disagree at that point. But I think that those were two incredible points that were made. And Christian, thank you very much for coming today. I like the energy that you bring to this conversation. It's top notch. It's it's very, very it gives, I can see the vibe that you bring to the conversation. It makes a whole lot of sense to me. So Chloe, do you have any further questions for Christian before I ask him my final question? Or Kevin, do you have any questions for him?
Oh yeah, I would ask Christian, is there any case or is there any situation in your mind that the collective interest would override an individual interest?
Right. Okay, brother, there is no collective interest, my friend. There is no. Okay, so okay.
Right.
This is actually. Okay, no. Let me try to explain it as succinctly as possible. One of the biggest criticisms I get is that I'm not succinct enough. I'm trying to be, but these are very difficult issues. So, okay. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this idea. He was a philosopher which inspired a lot of modern-day leftists in terms of their ideas of inequality and whatever. He had this idea of the sort of general will and the social contract being that which benefits the whole, and the sovereign, the general will being that which orders what is good for society, all that kind of stuff. And in his system, the common good is what is good for the general will, what is good for the whole. And this has been taken to obviously its tyrannical ends. Now, John Locke said in the Second Tudor Government, and John Locke is a philosopher who, among many others, has really inspired my philosophy. Locke said that it is in the benefit, it is the necessity of government and individuals to ensure the common good is protected. Okay, well, what did Locke mean by the common good? He didn't mean, he simply meant the protection of individual rights and fundamentally the valuation of who I am as a human being. That is what he said should be held as the common good. Now that's actually measurable because ideally it should be held in common to be good, that I have rights, that I am valuable, that I mean something, and that those rights are apodictic, simply means that they are things that are certain and ingrained into reality, and they cannot be infringed upon without some serious issues. But unfortunately, the idea of the common good went away from the Lockean definition, and it went towards the Rousseauian definition, and then it's been taken and twisted by both right-wingers and left-wingers alike, like people like Yoram Hazani, who wrote The Virtue of Naturalism, who's like, yeah, Locke is bad, the individual is bad, the family is where it's at, or other progressives who are like, no, forget the individual, we have to worry about the workers and the labor unions. It has been, this idea of the common good has been perverted. And collective interest has become this sort of monstrous concoction in their languages. But the truth is, values are held on an individual level, even if those values are similar across different people. But even then, that is not sufficient enough to call it a collective value, because the reasons, the genesis for those values, let me finish. The genesis for those values may be incredibly different according to each person, and they may be working for different ends. As I mentioned before, G.K. Chesterton, who was a British writer, he hated communism. I hate communism. We have something in common. We have values in common. But guess what? Chesterton also hated capitalism and wanted to have a sort of more communal understanding of economics. That's not my values. So again, even if someone's values are analogous to mine, that does not mean anything substantial that would form the intellectual foundation for the creation of the term collective interest. There is no collective interest. There are simply individual interests and values that may happen to be held in common sometimes. But what is certain is that values, every human being, whether they know it or not, has values. Every last one. Collectives, quote unquote collectives, may have values when it comes to politics or whatever. But ultimately, collectives, again, I'm using this word very loosely, don't have anything really tangible because it changes so much. So I reject this idea that there's collective interest. There's not. If there is a common good, it should be held in common that rights are important, the individual is important, but the Lockean understanding of that has gone far away from its initial importance, and it has been tainted and marred by the considerations of temporal politics. So there is no collective interest, to keep it short. There is none. There is none.
All right. Thank you.
Really?
Thank
Can
you,
I ask
Christian.
another question?
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Based on my definition of the collective interest, do you remember the definition I gave you?
I remember the definition of the word collective, which I think you're misusing that word. I think that you'd be best to use the word collaboration. Collective and collaboration have two different meanings. They have two different meanings, my friend. They have two different meanings, at least as it relates to the history of political philosophy. Maybe in other kind of contexts, they have probably similar meanings. Really, no, I mean, really, you can laugh what you want. I mean, really, they have different meanings. They do.
Because I think to a person who doesn't know stuff, you come off as very, what do I say? I think you play very fast and sometimes with certain, but I think if somebody listen to your argument, they fall apart after some scrutiny.
Okay, so what part of my argument is wrong? Are you telling me that collectives and political philosophy?
Where do people?
No. Are you telling me collectives? Are you telling me collectives? At least, are you telling me the word collective?
Kevin, I don't want this to turn into a debate. This is not a debate. This is
no, man. It's a discussion. It's a discussion, man.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't think you calling to question his how will I put it was all right. He has his own positions. You have your own positions.
Yeah.
They can
he
both valid.
disagrees, and that's fine.
Christian have no problem, Charles. I don't know. I think you're over analyzing the situation. Christian don't have a problem with what's going on.
Okay.
Kevin has his opinion. He kind of called me a pseudo-intellectual just now, but that's fine. I get called it a lot, and that's fine. I don't care.
No. Christian, I watched the debate that you have with Sam and critical race theory, right? And I do sometimes, I think if you're talking to an audience who does not know a lot of stuff or does not think about certain stuff, you will are somewhat predisposed to a certain bias. You will come off as, okay, I'm not saying you don't know what you're talking about, but I'm saying sometimes I think you miss the point sometimes. And this is why I want to ask one question though. Where do people get their values from? You speak of value of such an abstract term. Are you just dependent on individuals?
No, value is not abstract. No, value is not abstract.
No, but based on the answer you give, that's what you outlined value. Like we should take in consideration value whatsoever. Where do you think people's values come from?
That depends on the person ultimately. Ideally, I know where it should come from, which is not really your question, but I think it might get us around to your question. They should come from, at the very basic level, the family, through their rearing and things of that sort. And for a lot of folks, that's where they do come from. And certain people in their family instill certain kind of values. The value a mother might instill in someone might not be the value a father instills in someone. So even when you view the family as an institution, as a collective, you still have different gradations of what kind of values are bestowed upon someone according to whoever might be bestowing it. So that could be one point, but there are plenty of points in our life where we move beyond the scope of the family and we get into different other areas. We may get into areas where our friend groups are morphing our values, or where a philosopher that we read might influence our values. It depends. It really depends on a lot of things.
All right. Can I ask another question? Do
Is this
you
a
think
question or
last question?
Do you think
Okay.
a lot of our values are derivative of Judeo-Christian values?
Who is us? You're being vague. You accuse me of being a pseudo-intellectual, and now you're being very vague.
America, right?
What do you
This is
mean?
not vague. This is not vague. America.
Who is us? Who's us? Oh, what is America? What do you mean?
People in America.
There are 330 million people in America of different religions and backgrounds and cultures. I cannot give you a single answer as to where all their values come from. Now that would be pseudo-intellectualism.
Okay,
You can laugh all you want, brother. It's just very
You
ironic what's
don't
happening.
think, like when I listen to a lot of person in
It's
America speak, you don't think Christian religion plays a very important or integral role in electing politicians. You don't think a lot of people derive their values
I
from
didn't say
Christianity?
that. You made a blanket question. Where do all of us in America get our values from? I think that is a
Where do
bad
some
question.
people in America get their values from? Where
Oh,
do you
stop.
think some
Which
people in America
people?
get their
Which
values from?
people? You're talking about evangelicals in the South. You're talking about Quakers in Pennsylvania. You're talking about Hindus in New York City. You're talking
I
about Buddhists.
specifically
Who are you
said
talking
Jews.
about?
all right,
Who?
Mr. Pilu, welcome to the
Hi.
conversation.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah,
How's
Hello.
we're
everybody
doing
doing
good. How
today?
you?
I was at work, so I couldn't get to most of the conversation. But in the topic about living conservatively and voting liberally, or living right and voting left, on that topic, I would have to say, as somebody who's lived in America my entire life, and I've noticed that to me, it's more like this. I think the black community, from my assessment of somebody who's lived in it, is more about voting tribe. We vote tribe more than conservative. Nothing. It's literally a tribal vote.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Unfortunately,
Yeah. Yep.
no.
Yep.
Yeah, no. Whatever was said before I came, I don't know. I was at work, so I was coming in and out, so I couldn't really listen
Yeah.
to everything that was. I'm speaking on the topic because I'm kind of lost about where we at. I'm lost on where we at in the conversation, except for what I just heard between you and Kevin. But but I don't know everything that was said. But just on the title, on topic of hand, it's more about voting tribe more than anything. I mean, it's more about living tribe and voting tribe. The black community lives tribe and votes tribe, if that makes sense. So it might look like is voting conservative, liberal, and living conservative, but just it's all tribe when it comes to Black America in a way, because Black America has basically, for lack of a better word, been put in a situation where that's how they see themselves, as a tribe. So it became a thing in the Black community that being part of the Black tribe, quote unquote, was voting Democrat. Unfortunately, that's the case. I mean, well, some people say fortunately, some people say unfortunately, no matter your political persuasion. So it's a tribal thing. So so with that being said, how do we develop intellectual diversity in the Black community? That's a lot of different things, but I do think we should separate tribe from partisan politics if you can. I think that separation would grow the Black political influence, the social influence together, because what happens now is it seems to me, I know I'm saying gonna be controversial, but me growing up, it seemed my whole life, it seemed like voting a certain way was almost like a cult in the Black community, and we have to take away our cult allegiance to certain labels and certain parties and things like that, and have and be able to have multiple parties and be able to have, we get put like this, to make a long story short, monopoly is usually not a good thing for the consumers, and in politics the consumers are the voters, right? So we put ourselves in unnecessary monopolies where we're losing out on utility. That's what I have to say about that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Pilu. So Chloe, before Benjamin goes, Chloe, you have some things to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually kind of relevant to the disagreement between Christian and Kevin. So obviously, Christian is arguing that you should basically act in the interest of your individual rights, your individual values, and who cares about the collective, or who cares about what society thinks. And then Kevin thinks like there should be collective or actions that is in response to the whole societal image of you know, an institution or a situation. But I have an interesting anecdote in which so I have a friend who was involved in tribal politics. Her tribe is in the northwest, Pacific Northwest of America, and they actually had a tribal vote. They're going to have a vote on whether they should allow gay marriage, right? And so and because, you know, they do still have their native values, right? But they were, you know, there was the Indian schools, and so a lot of them had converted to Christianity, and so they had a perception of what the tribe was going to, how they were going to vote, right? And they had a perception of, you know, using Christian terms, like their society and of what their collective will would be. And the perception was that they all were going to vote against gay marriage because they're all Christian, and they, you know, based on those Christian values, that, you know, the vote was going to, you know, go towards, you know, going against gay marriage. But the interesting thing, when they all went to vote, they all voted on their personal values, which meant no one voted against gay marriage, even though they all publicly were voicing against gay marriage because they believe that's what the collective wanted. They all individually decided to vote, and no one voted against gay marriage.
Wow.
So
okay.
Yeah. So I guess, like, just to kind of finish my point, I think that, you know, it's one thing to say, to point to society, you know, the society values, but you're only pointing to what you believe society values are. You can't actually point to what it really is. And everyone can also be making the same mistake at the same time. So we can't really ever know what society's values are until you actually see individual action.
Wow, that's
can I ask one Chloe a question?
Chloe, are you up for a question from Kevin?
Sure.
And I also want to hear Christian answer on this too. So, do you believe in democracy?
No, absolutely not.
Chloe?
No.
So it depends on it obviously depends on what context. I mean, we don't necessarily live in a democracy, at least in the United States. We live in a representative republic, right? And, you know, in small enough you know, communities, yes, democracy, you know, works out better than not. But yeah, I think it's not an easy question of if democracy in all cases, in all contexts, are universally good, because we don't want to vote away the rights. We don't have the majority voting away the rights of the individual.
All right, Benjamin, welcome to the conversation. So your thoughts?
Hi, Charles. Christian, I was really appreciating your, right off the bat, you said something about your political alignment, and you said that you were a conservatarian, I think. And I loved that. I never knew that someone had basically, like, I don't know, I don't study these things too deeply, but you basically put your finger right on kind of where I am as a person. You know, I had this very kind of conservative upbringing, but I, you know, am very much a libertarian in terms of, like, in terms of the way that I look at government and laws and all of those kinds of things. So I wanted to say thank you for kind of broadening my my verb. I don't know. What am I trying to say? My words. Broadening my words. In any case, besides that, you sound like a really cool dude, and I hope you keep doing what you're doing.
Well, I'm pleased by the flattery, but your reaction to my words says much more about you, your intellectual integrity, and how far you are on your intellectual journey than it does anything about me. So I actually give all the credit to you, my friend, and it's indicative of your mindset. So really, you should be patting yourself on the back. I don't deserve any of the praise. I don't deserve any of the credit. You should be patting yourself in the back. But regardless, thank you, and I'm really appreciative of your plaudits.
Well, I'm definitely going to be looking into your YouTube channel, because I have a feeling that you're talking about a lot of things that I would be very interested in. So, yeah.
Well, I always appreciate new viewers. Always.
All right. Let me ask Christian the final question before we end for today. So, Christian, do you think that this racial balkanization that's in America today, do you think it can ever be repaired, can ever be healed? Do you think there can be a racial reckoning where people move past the hurt and people just see themselves first as individuals before seeing themselves in terms of their racialized groups?
Right. I think a lot of folks already do, in all honesty. They may not be in the political mainstream, or maybe they are in some quarters, but they may not be the voices that you see parade in front of the media cameras, who always are brought on CNN or MSNBC or whatever, talk about race, but they exist, and they're way more than people think. A lot of people, and I live in the South. I talk to a lot of folks in the South who are in their 60s and 70s, white and black alike. And a lot of folks are like, yeah, the white kids in my neighborhood in the 60s, we didn't really talk about race. My mom let me play with them. They play with me, and we enjoyed it. We enjoyed ourselves. Now, obviously, this was not a universal experience on the systemic level, but in terms of interpersonal relationships, I think that the issue of race has been our understanding about race and its really insignificance to the human experience has been accentuated over time. And especially with the advent of the interconnected world of the internet, the digital age, we've seen that even more accentuated and emphasized. So yes, I think many folks already are outside of the sort of balkanization. The real question is, will the media narrative surrounding race fuel a fire, a malevolent fire in the hearts of people who may be otherwise well-meaning on both sides of the political aisle, that might move them towards certain kinds of actions on race that are not wise, whether it's anti-racism activism, whether it's being racist towards black folks, because there are some critical race theorists that attack white folks. Regardless of what wrong idea it is, can the media narrative do that? And the answer is yes, it has, and that's the biggest threat, because it doesn't take an entire society to make something come down. I mean, the American Revolution was not created by an entire society; it was created by a few folks, right? The horrors of the French Revolution were caused, well, in part, by Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety, which are just a few folks. I mean, only a few people can change everything. A few folks can change everything. That's what we should be concerned about. Be concerned about the media narrative. Be concerned about the propaganda. Be concerned about the ideas of human life that are detached from the individual and attached to these abstract, immeasurable concepts like blackness. Be concerned about that, because that is what's going to destroy things and ruin things and disconnect us from the truth. But the best thing is, you can resist those narratives. It may be hard. They become institutionalized. A lot of universities, a lot of corporations have diversity offices, and they're forcing people to listen to this nonsense at the risk of their livelihoods. So yeah, it can be hard, but we need to do what is right, because guess what? What is right is not always, and in most cases, it's not what is easy. So we all have the capacity, the volition to resist the propaganda and to resist its pernicious manifestations across society. But do we have the will? Well, I think many people do. Some folks just got to get over that hump. As for me in my house, I mean, I've been snubbing orthodox narratives since I think I came out of the womb. So that's my disposition towards the entire thing. So yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Christian. So Kevin, your final words for this stream. Then we'll go to Mr. Pelu, Benjamin, Chloe, then Christian will just end for us.
There's a lot of stuff I wrote down here that I'd want to comment on, but I'll keep it short as possible. I would like to debate Christian and libertarianism. I would really like to, because I do not think there's any such thing as right wing libertarianism. I think it's somewhat of an oxymoron. I think it's not a true reflection of liberty. I think it betray, and that's why originally the term libertarianism have its root in left wing ideology. If we go back to the etymology of the word, but I would like to have a discussion with Christian and libertarianism and what true liberty is. Um, um, as always, I enjoy being here. I like the back and forth. And Charles, it's not personal. It's never personal. I think sometimes you overreact sometimes in certain situation. It's never personal for me, and I don't think it's ever personal for any of your guests on the show. I think we are all adults, and sometimes the conversation tend to get heaty, and I don't think I think when we leave this conversation, we like, okay, that was just a heaty back and forth, and that's it. But as always, thanks for having me, and I always appreciate being on here.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for coming. I always appreciate your opinions and your voice as well. Mr. Pilu.
Yes, thanks for having me again. I appreciate it, listening. I'll go back and I'll try to go back and watch the beginning of everything I missed. But I just want to make one comment about things about one comment according to what I just heard Christian say. Yeah, we might have abstractions of blackness, but like blackness is part of people's identity, and I don't think, to make a long story short, I believe that the blackness is not necessarily a bad thing. I believe blackness is it can be an asset to America. Is part of America's history. And it connects America to different parts of the world. And blackness identity the same way American is an identity. So it depends if identities are useful or unuseful, because identities are unuseful are going to fade away. But certain identities are still useful. If people find use, value in blackness, it's still going to be there. Like I personally find value in blackness, and I'm not saying that everybody should. I'm just saying that there's going to be a people who will find value in blackness, and they'll still live it out. Now, just because they live out blackness, I don't think in any way it takes away from their Americanness. So that's what I want to say. So as I'm saying, tribe is not, to me, tribe is not necessarily bad, because tribe reflects reality, but it's how you apply your tribe to your environment. Because a tribe could do a lot of good for people, but a tribe could also come into conflict. So it's about conciliation, culture, manners, and socialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pilu. Benjamin.
Well, when I was listening to this, I just am struck, as I often am, and I say this to Charles and Chloe frequently. The thing that we all have in common is the things we care about. I think that, from what I heard, I didn't catch the entire conversation, but I caught most of it. Christian is a person who's deeply concerned about, Western civilization, about basically just kind of conserving the best aspects of the American project, and really just in decency and some of these things which honestly these days just don't get much merit anymore. A lot of this stuff is considered not interesting or even colonial at this point. And I just got to say, I really, really appreciate these conversations. It means a lot to me. For myself, I've always said I have a wonderful family, but I've also said that just being blood doesn't make you, it makes you family, but it doesn't mean that they're the people that you really care about. I'm of the opinion that, when we find people who are of like minds, who care about the same things, and even if we don't care for the same reasons, as Christian alluded to, it's still a wonderful thing. And I am just so excited to know you all and to be able to participate in these things. So, let's just keep it going. And cheers, Christian. Appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Thank you, Benjamin. Chloe.
Yeah, great conversation and fun conversation as always. And I definitely agree with Christian in terms of his conception of what society is kind of the concrete relationships that you have with people, and it took me a while to realize that myself. I shouldn't necessarily concern myself with an idea of who I am as an abstract from someone in a trailer park somewhere in Alabama. I should care about my neighbors. I should care about my coworkers, my boss, the people I actually relate to. And, in my life, whenever I have realized that the person I am associating with, I'm interacting with, views my arbitrary identities as the primary interface in which they're interacting with me on, it becomes very apparent, and because I have a freedom of association, I disassociate from those people, and it's very jarring when you realize that, like, oh, you're not actually interacting with me, you're interacting with this abstract of Black woman, yada yada yada, and it's very obvious that those types of people. You can't really get very far with those types of people. They're kind of stuck, and if they do that with you, they also do that with these other things, right? It means that they cannot take in new information and augment their behavior or their approach to life. So it's not even just about in terms of racism or in terms of those big topic issues. They also probably wouldn't be able to piece together reality when it comes in front of them for other more mundane topics. So I think that it's a kind of a deeper problem than how we conceive the concept of racism as. But yeah, so I think that we need to focus on our concrete reality and our concrete relationships that actually make up our lives and make up our experiences, and realize that we have the ability to shape our lives and our experiences.
Thank you very much, Chloe. So, Christian, I would like you to have the last word. So, can you just briefly comment on the topic again, which is socially conservative or politically liberal, and we'll be done.
Yeah, well, look, I want to thank everyone for partaking in this conversation with me. Even if we got heated in some instances, I do believe that, as John Stuart Mill said in chapter 4 of On Liberty, I think, that the only way to exchange error for truth is through discourse, because discourse is the sort of foundation of human knowledge. So, in the course of discourse, you have a lot of things get tense, the passions overflow, and things of that sort. But it's all good fun for me. That's what I do for a living. So, but yeah. So, as I mentioned before, if anyone has gotten anything out of this conversation, my prayer is that the biggest problem with among African Americans generally, not everyone, of course, generally in the United States, is they don't have a self-perception that is divorced from an abstraction, which is tied to political processes. That's a way of saying that they don't see themselves independent of systems or institutions. In other words, they don't value the fullest extent of their individuality, and thus they don't have the fullest sense of that rational self-love that National Author said was what was essential for living a life harmonious with human value. So that's part of my project. Now, again, I on my channel, I address plenty of other things other than race. But that's part of my project is to help people, Black Americans and other Americans, realize that they're much more than what their political identification might say. They're much more than what some people who have been in the media, who have been in society, who have been trying to sell them a bad bill of goods have been trying to say. And they can find out who they are by spending some time with themselves, being introspective, embracing epistemic humility, and living and going through life. I think those things, which don't really require you to have all this information about certain kinds of ideas, like, institutional oppression or whatever, those things, those very bare facts of life can help you live a good life and help you live a moral life as well. So again, I want to thank you, Charles, for reaching out to me. You kept coming. You kept going. I've been missing an absence for a little bit, but you kept going, and you kept trying to get me. And he left. But I'm gonna keep talking though, because I assume he can hear. I don't know, through this feed or whatever. But you kept going. You kept trying to come after me to get me on the show, and I'm happy you did. So thank you a lot, and I'd be happy to come back.
Oh, that's great, Sam. I'm glad to hear that. So thank you very much, Christian, for being a splendid guest today. Your thoughts are they are sharp and they're incisive, and I very much value your time that you spent with us today. In this channel. I also want to appreciate every other person, Kevin Black as usual, Mr. Pelu, Benjamin, Chloe, and every other person in the comment section. Thank you all for coming today, and I hope to catch you guys in another live stream soon. So that's it for now. So please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And if you like what we're doing, you can check out my book, my crime fiction novel on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description of this video so you can check it out. It's a crime fiction mystery crime fiction novel, but it also touches on some of the race discussions that we'll talk about in this channel. So it will make for a very, very interesting read. So until next time, guys, remain awesome. Thank you for coming. Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right, bye, everybody.